Welcome back everyone. Today I'm going to be carrying on with my alphabet tag series. For those of you that don't know about this series, it's basically where I get a list of questions that start with the letter of the alphabet that I'm currently on, and I answer those questions. But before I do, I just wanted to give you a brief update about the channel and how things have been going for the past few weeks. Some of you will have noticed that I've been uploading less regularly than I usually do, and that's because I'm currently on the job market and things are quite stressful. So for the time being, I think I'm just going to be uploading videos once every 2 weeks, because that seems to be something that I can commit to and keep doing regularly. So at least for now, that's what I'm going to be doing with the channel going forward. The only exception to this is when I finally get round to my reader's guides, which are still on the back burner a bit, but I do now have the scripts for them, so I'll start recording those soon. And when those are out, there'll be more regular videos, but I'll keep you posted about that. But yeah, for now, just one video every 2 weeks is how we're going to go. E is for finish this word with your favourite E-named author. Now, when I looked at my Goodreads, I didn't have much option when it came to E-named authors. In fact, I only had 2, and I'm going to talk about one later in the video, so I'm going to go with the only other option that I had, and that is Umberto Eco. I read The Name of the Rose a very long time ago now for a book club that I was in. I haven't read this book since then, and I don't know if I will, but it is one of those books that's just stuck with me ever since I've read it. It's probably one of the most unique and distinctive novels that I've read, especially in terms of its atmosphere and its style. It's part murder mystery, it's part philosophy, and it's part history and theology as well. I'm not gonna lie, some bits of the book are quite dry, and I think that's probably why my intentions to read it aren't particularly strong, but I did enjoy it at the time, and I do think if you like a book that has a lot of kind of academic sort of content to it and substance, then it's definitely a book worth reading. And Eco is definitely a very interesting writer. There are lots of mysteries and intrigue going on, not just in the stories that he tells, but just in his prose as well. So yeah, he did kind of win this award just by a process of elimination, but Eco is a great writer and one that's definitely worth checking out. E is for evil. Who is the evilest character in all of literature? This is a tricky one because there are lots of different kinds of evil characters, so the best way to answer this question would be to think about different kinds of evil characters and give one for each of them. So first of all, we've got the big bad evil that's just all-encompassing evil, no redeeming qualities. And with this, I think I'm going to go with the Dark One from the Wheel of Time series. Now, as your all-encompassing evil types go, the Dark One isn't the most interesting. He doesn't have a tragic backstory or really any kind of interesting, morally complex backstory, because he just represents the force of evil. And while that might sound quite boring, it's quite interesting from a kind of philosophical perspective and world-building perspective, because Jordan basically makes the Dark One a kind of necessary feature of reality for the characters in his world to have free will. The thought being that if you took away evil, people would be constricted to just making good choices, so they wouldn't really have free will anymore. And that's really interesting, and it's the kind of fantasy that I like. I like a fantasy book where the author is creating the magic and the world and making that a part of the story and the kind of broader philosophical themes in the story, rather than just, say, coming up with an imaginary world and a magic system that doesn't really interact with the story that's being told all that much. It's just like a fancy add-on, if you like. So that's why I like the Dark One as a evil villain, because it just works in terms of the themes of the story, and that's what makes it interesting. Thinking about a more human villain though, I would go with Baby Kachama from The God of Small Things. This is a woman who betrays her family because she is selfish and bitter and jealous of them. And this results in the death of her niece's lover, who is an innocent man who gets brutalized by the police. And she also destroys the lives of her grandniece and nephew as well. Horrible woman, and while I did find that when I reread this book I found her to be a little bit more sympathetic, she's still just a horrible person and a very good human kind of villain. And lastly, thinking about a villain that's maybe somewhere in between, a kind of tragic villain if you like, I'd go with Dorian from The Picture of Dorian Gray. He starts off, not the greatest person in the world, but he seems reasonably nice, a bit narcissistic and full of himself, and you take that vanity and that desire to live forever, and he becomes this, shadow of his former self, and it's just a great story, and it's great to see a character go from someone who's, morally quite okay to something quite repulsive by the end of the story. So those are my choices for 3 evil characters, but do let me know what you think in the comments. E is for endurance. What book was the biggest struggle to finish? Now there are a couple of books that I didn't finish that I could include in this, but given that the thought here is endurance rather than just hard to read, I'm probably going to go with Juliet by the Marquis de Sade. It's not the most experimental book in the world, but it is one of the most disgusting books in the world. You basically have one incredibly perverted and orgiastic scene, followed by a very long philosophical rambling, and pretty much that's the entire book, and this book goes on for 1,200 pages. So you can imagine that that's going to get tiresome after, sitting down and reading it. It took me quite a few months to get through this book. I don't know exactly how many months, but it did take me a while, and it's just because I couldn't sit down and read this, in the way that I could just read so many other books. And that's not to say that it's a bad book or not worth reading, it's just to say that if you're going to commit to reading this, it's going to take you a lot of time and effort because it is just not the sort of book that you can pick up willy-nilly. I will also give a special mention here to Finnegan's Wake by Joyce, because I did start that book a few weeks ago, and I can already tell that's going to be quite an endurance challenge, and I'm not sure if I'll actually finish it, but if I do finish it, then that's definitely probably going to bump Juliet from the top spot of this list. E is for England. What is the greatest English novel? For me, that's going to be a toss-up probably between Wuthering Heights and David Copperfield. In terms of maybe like English or quintessential English themes, it seems to me like David Copperfield might get that a little bit better, just because it's the sort of book where it feels very much of its time and its place and its country. And Wuthering Heights, although it does certainly feel like, it evokes the Yorkshire Moors really well, and it embraces the kind of culture of the North, and the accents that she does are really effective in the text. But at the same time, it does have this sort of out of time, out of place feel to it, because it's just such an isolated book. So it's less kind of Englishy than I would say David Copperfield is, but at the same time, it's also a fantastic book. So for me, it's probably going to be those two things at the top of the pile. E is for ebooks. Do you prefer ebooks or physical books? For me, I have basically two reasons, one to prefer ebooks and one to prefer physical books. I prefer ebooks for practical reasons, because if you've got an ebook, you can just take it anywhere. It's a very slim thing to carry, whereas if you're reading a 1,000-page book, you can't really just carry that around with you very easily. But a Kindle, just fits in your pocket, so that's great. But then the aesthetics of physical books are obviously better than the aesthetics of Kindles, because with a Kindle it's just one little thing, and physical books are just beautiful things. So if I'm thinking aesthetics, physical books. If I'm thinking practicality, I'm thinking ebooks. So usually what I'll do is a kind of compromise between these two things, and I only really buy physical copies of books if I know, or I'm pretty confident that I'm going to like the book and I'm going to read it again and again. Whereas if it's a book that I don't know much about, so usually for book clubs, I won't buy the physical copy, I'll just have it on ebook, and if I really enjoy it and think, okay, I'm going to read this again, then I might actually buy it physically as well. E is for experimental. What is your favourite experimental novel? Well, I really enjoyed Ulysses when I read it. I think it's a fantastic book, and although it's difficult, the difficult stuff doesn't get in the way of the heart of the story. It's quite a moving story of this guy and his family and his problems, and the kind of experimental stuff doesn't get in the way of that or distract from it, which, in a lot of experimental books that can be the case. So that's going to be up there. Obviously, The Waves by Virginia Woolf is also going to be up there, as I've talked about very recently. I think that's a fantastic book and a very underrated book within her own catalogue. And I'm also going to mention The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman by Angela Carter, another fantastic experimental book with a lot of humour to it and just really off the walls. If you want a book that just goes all over the place, then I definitely recommend that book. E is for Eliot. Have you read any books by George Eliot? Yes is the short answer to that. I read Middlemarch for the first time this year, and I have to say, it's one of those books where I know everyone who's read it has raved about it. It's one of those books that always comes at the top, at least nowadays, of like best English novels, and sometimes it even comes at the top of best ever novels lists. And so I think my expectations were maybe just too high to enjoy this book, because while I did enjoy it, I just didn't really get the hype for this book at all. I think it's a good book, I think it's an interesting book, but I just just didn't grab me in the way that something like David Copperfield did, or Wuthering Heights, or Crime and Punishment, or any of the other books that I've talked about on the channel that I've really enjoyed. I think part of that might just be my personal bias though. I don't really like social novels, except maybe the Brontes are an exception, but that's just because they add a bit of violence into their social novels and there's a bit of grit to their novels, whereas Middlemarch is quite quaint and sort of like English country village, and that's not really my thing. So it could be my personal bias seeping into this. One thing I will say though about Eliot's writing style is that I do think it's very engaging. I didn't really struggle to read the book at all, whereas with some older texts they can be quite a slog to get through because of the kind of quaint writing styles. And I also think that some of the characters and storylines were really well done, especially the character of Dorothea and her marriage to the old priest, I think he is, or scholar, Casaubon. I thought that was a really good story and really interesting. But yeah, it didn't wow me in the way that it seems to wow so many people. So if Middlemarch is one of your favourite books, let me know in the comments what it is that draws you back to the book, because I think I will reread it at some point, and I'll certainly read more of Eliot's work. So I'd like to know going in again, like, what should I be looking out for to appreciate it in the way that other people seem to. E is for epistlery. Do you enjoy novels told in the epistolary form? Like most questions like this, the answer is always going to be yes, so long as it's done well. I think one big issue that you can have with an epistolary novel is that obviously the perspectives and the characters are going to have very distinctive writing styles, because assuming that it's more than one character writing letters, you're going to need to have a different style for every character. And sometimes that doesn't quite work. And in fact, I'm going to use Dracula as an example of something that works in parts, but not others. I've always found that the first half of Dracula is where the characters all come across as very distinctive. If you get a passage by Lucy, it's very different from a passage by Mina, and it's very different from a passage by Jonathan. But then as the story kind of progresses and we focus more on the action and the build-up to hunting Dracula, the distinctiveness of the characters' voices seems to go away and is stripped back. Now that could be for like particular reasons. It could be that the characters by this point have like bound together and become a unit or force, and they're destroying Dracula, and so that's kind of mirrored in the way that the story is told. Or it could just be that at this point Stoker is focusing more on the tension and the adventure, and so less so on developing character voices. But either way, I think, if you're going to do epistolary, you just need to make sure that you get those voices and make them very distinctive. E is for elephant. What is the biggest book you've read this year? This is going to depend by what we mean by big. So according to my Goodreads, the biggest book in terms of size, page count, is The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser. This is a very epic poem. In fact, I think it might be one of the longest poems ever put to page. It's 1,248 pages, or at least the copy of the book that I have is. So that was a big thing to get through. But obviously it's a poem, so the actual word count is a lot less because it's, in thin stanzas. So if we're going by that, then probably the book that was the longest that I've read this year in terms of word count is going to be the Bible. I believe this one is over 700,000 words, and I haven't actually finished the Bible yet, but I'm almost there. I started it in January, and my kind of aim has been to read it within a year, and it's pretty much looking like I'm going to do that, so I'm just going to say that one because I think it's a pretty good prediction that I will actually get it done. So that's the longest thing that I read this year. And in fact, thinking about that endurance question, this was quite an endurance test as well, because some passages of the Bible are just very, very dry and repetitious. And the last question, E is for early. What is the earliest book you remember reading? This is a tough one to answer because at a certain point memories just kind of blur and it's hard to really piece together or string together which, ones come first. So I'm just going to kind of say a few things here. One of the first books I remember being read to by my dad was the Dr. Seuss books, especially Green Eggs and Ham. I think that was my favourite back then. But I also liked The Cat in the Hat, and I also had a copy of The Grinch. So those things are quite early in my memory. There's also the Biff and Chip books from school, or the Magic Key books, I think was the series. And these were books about a magical key that these kids have that transforms things, I think. I don't remember any of the stories, but I do remember thinking that the female character whose name is Biff was called Beef because the brother was called Chip, so I thought they were called Beef and Chips. And that's pretty much all I remember from that series. I also know my grandma had some books of fairy tales and also a collection of poetry, I think maybe by Blake, but I'm not sure, that I also read at a reasonably early age. But again, I can't exactly pinpoint when and where all this stuff occurred. I just know that it occurred, deep in the dregs of the memory somewhere. So probably one of them. Alright, that's it for this tag. Let me know how you'd answer some of these questions down in the comments. I'll be doing the F tag in the future, and if you have any F-themed questions that you'd like me to answer, also let me know in the comments. But that's it for this video, so take care everyone. Ta-ra!